The archives were my haven, a place where time seemed to fold in on itself. Rows upon rows of records stretched endlessly, their whispered histories echoing softly in the dim, fluorescent-lit air. The Historical Society building wasn't grand, but it had an undeniable charm. Decades of dust and stories clung to its walls, creating an ambiance of quiet authority. It was during a slow evening, as the winter wind howled outside, that I first noticed the lockbox. Hidden behind the rusted metal cabinets labeled Unsorted Acquisitions, it seemed entirely out of place. The box itself was unremarkable, a dull, weathered tin about the size of a briefcase, with a small latch locked tight by an antique brass mechanism. What caught my attention was the tag affixed to it. For official use only. The handwriting was neat but faded, as though someone wanted the note to survive the passing years, yet not too vividly. "What are you hiding?" I murmured, tracing my fingers along the cold surface. I was alone, as usual, with the soft hum of the overhead lights and the occasional creak of the building to keep me company. There was no immediate reason to feel uneasy, yet my heart began to race. Something about the box's presence felt wrong, like an anomaly that shouldn't exist. The air grew colder near it, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been waiting for me. My supervisor, Evelyn, had been clear about the rules. No opening sealed items without her consent. But Evelyn wasn't here tonight. She had left an hour earlier, her tired voice instructing me to lock up at 10. Besides, this box wasn't marked with any filing code or acquisition record. It didn't officially exist. Curiosity gnawed at me, its claws sharp and relentless. With trembling hands, I carried the box to my desk under the flickering pool of yellow light. The lock resisted my attempts to force it open, its mechanism ancient and stubborn. Frustration surged, mingling with an inexplicable fear that I couldn't quite name. Finally, I reached for the small ring of skeleton keys that hung on the wall, relics from the old storage cabinets. One of the keys slid into the lock with an unnerving ease. The latch gave a sharp click, and the box fell open. A faint, musty smell escaped, like air that hadn't moved in centuries. Inside was a collection of yellowed papers bound with twine, their edges curled and brittle. A sense of unease settled over me as I untied the bundle. The documents were written in a peculiar mix of languages, mostly English, but with occasional Latin phrases and symbols scattered throughout. I scanned the first page, its ink faded, but legible. The Society of Echoes, established under the veil of necessity, seeks not to exist, but to persist. For those who belong, time is an illusion. The words felt heavy, as if they carried a weight beyond their meaning. I turned the page, uncovering a list of names written in an elegant script. Some names were familiar, etched in the fabric of local history. But others... My breath caught when I spotted a name that shouldn't have been there. Mine. I stared at the page until the letters blurred, my name standing out starkly among strangers who had no business sharing its space. It wasn't just my name. It was my handwriting. The curl of the Y, the subtle slant of my E. This wasn't a mistake or a coincidence. I shoved the papers back into the box and closed the lid with a clatter, my chest tightening as if the air itself had grown thicker. The room felt too quiet now, as if the building itself were holding its breath. For a long moment, I sat in the silence, willing the unease to dissipate. It didn't. "Okay," I whispered to myself, forcing a nervous laugh. "You're just tired. Too many late nights and dusty records." Yet the excuse rang hollow. The feeling of being watched prickled at the back of my neck, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker than before. My gaze darted toward the security camera mounted in the corner. Its little red light blinked rhythmically, indifferent to my spiraling thoughts. I found myself wishing it wasn't there, as though its presence was an intrusion. Against my better judgment, I opened the box again. The documents no longer seemed fragile. They felt alive, humming faintly as though they carried a pulse. My hands trembled as I sifted through pages of meeting minutes, cryptic diagrams, and what appeared to be correspondence between members of this Society of Echoes. One letter, dated July 13th, 1937, caught my attention. The handwriting was slanted and ornate, and the parchment crackled faintly as I unfolded it. To our esteemed archivist, our efforts are now etched into the fabric of this reality, yet we must persist. You hold the thread between our past and our present. Be mindful. The shadows are not always cast by the light. They are watchers as much as you're a keeper. My skin crawled as I read the last line. The idea of being a keeper resonated with an eerie familiarity, though I couldn't pinpoint why. I turned the letter over and scrawled on the back in smeared ink was a question. Do you know who watches you? The room seemed colder, darker. Somewhere beyond the walls, a faint sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping, drifted into the silence. It was deliberate, steady, like a clock ticking just out of sight. I glanced around, but there was nothing out of place, just the papers, the box, and me, and the feeling that I was no longer alone. The tapping followed me. At first I convinced myself it was the old pipes in the walls or the subtle creaks of the building settling in the cold. But as I paced the archives, each step accompanied by the faint tick-tick-tick, the sound became an undeniable presence. It wasn't mechanical, it was deliberate. I returned to my desk, hoping that distraction might chase away the unease curling in my chest. Yet when I reached for the documents, they no longer appeared as they had minutes ago. Several of the pages were blank now, their text vanished into the yellowed paper as though it had never been there. My name, once so disturbingly vivid, was gone. The room itself felt wrong. The air was heavier, like the breath of a crowd in a place meant for solitude. The shadows along the walls didn't seem to obey the weak flicker of the fluorescent lights. They shifted and swayed on their own, bending in directions no light source could explain. I told myself to focus. I retrieved the first page again, the one with the Society's name and cryptic motto. As I stared at the phrase, "Time is an illusion," a memory surfaced, a conversation with Evelyn from my first week as an intern. She had offhandedly mentioned the Society when introducing me to the archive's older collections. "They pop up in records now and again," she'd said, flipping through a ledger. "A group of academics, I think. Private, very secretive, but no one talks about them much anymore. At the time, I hadn't thought twice about it. Now I wished I'd asked more." The clock above the door chimed faintly, announcing the hour, though I could have sworn it wasn't set to chime. The sound snapped me out of my thoughts, and I resolved to call Evelyn in the morning. Surely she could explain this anomaly. My name in the papers, the strange history of the Society of Echoes, and the disappearing text. I moved to close the box again, but as I reached for the lid, a breeze swept through the room. It was cold and sharp, far too sudden for the stillness of the archives. My heart lurched as the papers fluttered, scattering across the desk and floor. I scrambled to collect them, each sheet more unsettling than the last. Several were now completely blank, but one bore a single line of fresh ink at its center. "You should not have opened the box." My throat tightened. The ink was wet. I staggered backward, clutching the note as though it might burn me. As I stared, the letters began to fade, dissolving into the paper like ink sinking into water. I rubbed my eyes, certain I was hallucinating, but when I looked again, the page was blank. The tapping sound grew louder. I couldn't stay in that room another second. Grabbing my bag, I stuffed the remaining documents inside, slammed the lockbox shut, and hurried toward the exit. I locked up quickly. the weight of the keychain cold in my shaking hand, and stepped out into the frigid night air. The silence of the city streets was a relief at first, but as I walked home, the tapping returned. It was faint, nearly imperceptible, but it echoed in my ears like a phantom heartbeat. By the time I reached my apartment, my nerves were raw, and the papers in my bag seemed to hum faintly, as though alive. That night's sleep evaded me. I stayed awake, staring at the shadows crawling across my ceiling, and swore I heard faint whispers between the ticks of the phantom tapping. The next morning, I arrived at the archives early, hoping to find Evelyn before the day began. The office was dimly lit, the fluorescent bulbs buzzing faintly. But her chair sat empty, her coat absent from the hook on the wall. She didn't show up that day, or the next. My unease deepened when I tried to search for her in the system, only to find no records of her employment. Her personnel file, emails, even her name in the office directory, gone. It was as if she had never worked there. Even my coworkers, when pressed, gave vague, dismissive responses. "Evelyn, are you sure you've got the right name?" I retreated to the archives, desperate for answers. The lockbox sat on my desk where I had left it, its weight an oppressive reminder of my mistake. The documents inside were fewer now, their ink fading more rapidly each time I examined them. Then I found it, a note I hadn't noticed before, scribbled in the cramped margins of an otherwise blank page. "When the shadows stretch too long, it means they're watching. Only the key can end it. Find the seal." My pulse quickened. The words seemed both a warning and an instruction. A seal. I flipped through the remaining papers, searching for any clue. Among them, a rough sketch caught my eye, a symbol carved into a circular disc, marked with intricate, almost hypnotic designs. Beneath the drawing was an annotation, the seal of the Archivist, buried where time begins. Time begins. My mind raced, trying to decode the phrase. It seemed metaphorical, too vague to pinpoint. I leaned back, exhausted, letting the silence of the archives envelop me. But in the quiet, the tapping resumed, this time louder than ever. It was no longer an ambient noise. It was deliberate, close, and it was coming from beneath the floorboards. My heart thundered as I stood, unwilling to move but too terrified to stay still. The tapping paused, then shifted, traveling across the room as though something, or someone, was pacing below. I realized then, the archives had secrets far older than any of its records, and I had begun to uncover them. The tapping grew insistent, a slow and deliberate rhythm that resonated deep within the hollow silence of the archives. Each sound vibrated through the floorboards beneath me, setting my nerves alight. I stood frozen, staring at the lockbox as though it held all the answers and all the danger. "The seal of the Archivist," I whispered to myself, the words tasting strange on my tongue. The symbol from the sketch filled my mind, its spiraling lines twisting into impossible shapes. The phrase beneath it, "Buried where time begins," echoed over and over, a riddle wrapped in unease. Time begins. Could it mean the oldest section of the archives? The room where we stored centuries-old documents, the kind that had never seen daylight? The tapping stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was worse, a thick, suffocating void that pressed down on my chest. It felt expectant, as though something unseen was waiting for me to act. Gripping the lockbox tightly, I moved toward the far corner of the archives. This part of the building had always felt different, its air heavier and colder. The walls here were lined with ancient shelves, their contents wrapped in faded cloth and brittle paper. As I passed, the shadows seemed to lengthen, the dim light flickering unnaturally. At the center of the room stood a weathered table. Its surface was scarred from decades of use, and at its center was a faint circular mark, the same symbol from the sketch etched into the wood. I placed the lockbox on the table, its weight feeling final, like a stone dropped into deep water. As I did, the air seemed to shift. The fluorescent lights above dimmed until they barely glowed, and a faint hum filled the room, low and resonant, like the vibration of a distant bell. Instinctively, I pressed my hand against the etched symbol on the table. The wood was cold, unnaturally so, and as my palm made contact, the humming grew louder. The surface beneath my hand felt alive, pulsing faintly as though in rhythm with the tapping I had heard earlier. Then, the lockbox creaked open on its own. I staggered back, heart pounding as the lid lifted with agonizing slowness. Inside, the papers were gone, replaced by a single object, a circular disc of tarnished silver, engraved with the same spiraling symbol as the table. The seal. Its surface shimmered faintly, and though it lay motionless, I felt an undeniable pull, as though it were reaching out to me. My hand trembled as I reached for it, every instinct screaming at me to stop. But something deeper, something I couldn't name, compelled me forward. As my fingers closed around the disc, a rush of cold shot through my body, and the room plunged into darkness. I gasped, clutching the seal as the air around me seemed to come alive with whispers, soft, disjointed voices that spoke in languages I couldn't understand. They weren't malicious, but they carried the weight of centuries, a chorus of stories long buried and forgotten. A light flickered faintly at the edge of the room. It wasn't from the overhead fixtures, but from something far older. The glow illuminated faint carvings on the walls, symbols and words etched deep into the stone, telling stories I couldn't begin to comprehend. They shifted as I watched, rearranging themselves into new patterns, as though responding to the seal in my hand. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until one voice emerged, clear and steady. "You are the Archivist, keeper of what must remain." The words vibrated through me, resonating with a truth I couldn't deny. My role wasn't accidental. I had been chosen, just as those before me had been. The documents, the lockbox, the seal. They were part of a cycle, one that stretched beyond the limits of time. But why me? I asked aloud, my voice small against the vastness of the room. The answer came not in words, but in understanding, a flood of images and sensations that filled my mind. The Society of Echoes wasn't a group of scholars or historians. They were guardians, bound to preserve knowledge that could never be allowed to escape into the world. Their work had spanned centuries, and now I was part of it. The seal grew warm in my hand, its light intensifying. I felt its power settle over me, filling me with a strange mixture of dread and purpose. The whispers faded, leaving only silence. When the lights returned, the room was unchanged, but I wasn't. The lockbox sat closed on the table, its lid sealed tight once more. The seal was gone, though I could still feel its weight, as if it had been absorbed into me. The tapping had stopped, replaced by the steady hum of the building around me. I left the archives that night with a new understanding of my place. I wasn't just an intern or a curious researcher. I was a thread in the tapestry of something far greater, bound to a duty that I couldn't escape. As I locked the door behind me, I felt the shadows shift, watching. The air hummed faintly with an unspoken promise. This was only the beginning. And somewhere deep within the archives, the tapping resumed. The end lingers, suggesting a continuation of the cycle and leaving the unease unresolved.